Hi, this is Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank in Delray Beach. I'm glad you can join us today. This podcast is again the next three chapters of Guardians of the Dynasty. The actual title is in this printout because the title has been removed from the book by the U.S. government because they are, frauds. It's called A History of the U.S. Created Guardia Nacional de Nicaragua and the Somoza Family. It's a book by Richard Millett. And, we're going to do some background. I'm not, from here on in, I'm not going to be reading from a script. I'm going to just talk. So we found President Manchada, okay? President Manchada was in charge as the first president after the U.S. Intervention in Nicaragua. He was the first president that was independently assigned to take charge of the U.S. created National Guard in Nicaragua. And, American Nicaraguan National Guard creation was a political failure. It was a failure on all counts. Okay, the organization was supposed to be a nonpartisan organization to help the people manage, the country. It was not meant to cause political assassination, political imprisonment, political murder. None of that stuff was going to be part of the National Guard's original intention. The U.S. government was informed multiple times by multiple sources that the National Guard was becoming a partisan instrument in murder and, imprisonment and torture. They did not react. They did not say that they were going to, change their course. Their policy was set in stone. This is the problem with the U.S. government. They are frauds. They're illiterates. They are illiterates. They don't communicate. They have no idea what actually is communication. They don't know how to discuss with the people of Nicaragua, the Hispanics of Nicaragua. What is the problem with this organization? It is not working for the people. It is not working for the government of Nicaragua. They just leave and they wash their hands cold because they are negligent. That's the next part, is that they are negligent. So their illiteracy in this case, their lack of communication with the Nicaraguan, the Nicaraguan people and their, elected leaders was, abysmal. Again, another abysmal performance for the United States government. So then we talked about politics and personalities, Somoza and the National Guard. We wanted to make a few comments about Sandino. Okay, Sandino, Caesar Sandino was the Nicaraguan. He was a son of an illegitimate child from an Indian woman and a Hispanic landowner. He was just basically a mixed, mestizo. I guess you would call it a mestizo in the correct jargon. So Sandino was a great leader. He was a great leader. He was a great, guerrilla, representative. He was a great representative of the opposition. He had issues very much with United States imperialism and racist exploitation and the mass murder campaign by the U.S. government. He knew Somoza and the National Guard was going to be turned into an instrument of political assassinations. He knew the conservative oligarchy was going to take control of Nicaragua and rule it with an iron fist and steal the money and all of the resources of Nicaragua and give it to the United States government and the imperialists. And it would starve the Nicaraguan people. He knew all this. He was extremely intelligent individual. He's a brilliant man that, understood the U.S. government's real motives here. And he put up a fight. He put up a real fight against the U.S., murderous butchers. They're white supremacists, murderous butchers. And that's what they did. So it was a political failure. Okay, again, Somoza was a political failure. The U.S. intervention in Nicaragua was a political failure. It was a political failure through destabilization. They, meant to destabilize Nicaragua. Okay, the Marines went in an imperialist kind of show. This is all a show. Okay, the U.S. government goes in with its guns. It's a machine gun government of vicious thugs. They go in a political show. They act as if they're, champions of the people. They act as if we're going to construct a National Guard for your people. And then what do they actually do? The actual results is they construct a political assassination tool, just like the whites of America, just like the white supremacists of America, the white, murderous butchers of the U.S. government. They construct a political tool. The actual, election We talked about the election, the Nicaraguan election. You know, Richard Millett, again, I don't agree with many of his things. I don't agree with many of the things that he's puts forth. But I can tell you that the election was a fraud. The election was really a fraud. You know, how does Manchada come to power when there's a huge number of conservatives in the government? How does Manchada come to power when everyone hates Manchada's guts and he's obviously a political he imprisons people for political purposes? This was a major issue. Then we had budget restrictions on the American mission. They didn't want to pay money, which is typical of the U.S. government. They go on these imperial missions and they want to starve people because they don't have money to actually pay for the actual, intervention. It's a group of, illiterate thugs. They're illiterate white thugs. They get their literacy from their friends in Europe. That's the only thing. And even then, they still behave like illiterates and negligent thugs. They're negligent thugs. So we're going to talk about partisan versus the nonpartisan guard. A nonpartisan guard would have served as a good police force. It became a tool for political assassination, machine gun violence. The selection of the guard was very limited. The candidates for Somoza the candidates given to Somoza, which no one knows, probably an American Marine named Hanna, forced him to accept Somoza, who's a criminally insane butcher. So, the other thing was we're going to talk about Sandino, the Sandino murder. Okay, so Sandino was a guerrilla leader, and the U.S. government didn't tell Somoza not to murder him. They didn't issue an ultimatum. It didn't come from Stimson or from the U.S. government office. The State Department said nothing about the murder of Sandino. This is, in effect, complicity in his murder. They are racist, murderous, rapists, and butchers. They are butchers and murderous butchers of the U.S. government. They did this thing. Sandino came in a diplomatic mission. And so the negligent and illiterate whites of the U.S. government, the illiterate whites and negligent whites of the U.S. government refused to, acknowledge his presence. And, basically, the book is not truthful about Sandino's murder. They're not truthful with respect to Sandino's murder. They're not truthful with respect to, an actual who was responsible. Somoza was responsible for this murder. All of the information in the book, in addition to all of the information you can draw from multiple sources, indicates Somoza was responsible for the murder. He issued a premeditated murder order to murder, Somoza. And again, propaganda. The U.S. government is a propaganda state. They point machine guns at their scholars and say, you better say it like this. We know the U.S. government, they're illiterate, negligent whites. They're whites that are negligent. They're negligent whites and illiterate whites of the U.S. government. They're, just complete liars, fabricators, frauds. That is what they are. They are illiterate whites. Okay, so Sandino's murder we must attribute to Somoza. We must attribute it to Somoza. Somoza was the one that murdered Sandino. And, to go around and, all of the information, he issued the edict. He talked to Lane before. He said that, I can't, stop from murdering this guy. Can I imprison him? He has so many times, can I imprison him? Can I lock him up? All of these things came from Somoza's mouth. Then what's the purpose in discussing the fact that he didn't get murdered? It's because the U.S. government wants to propagandize its innocence. It is a group of guilty, shameless frauds. They're shameless whites of Washington. They are, vicious thugs. They are shameless whites. They're white, negligent illiterates of Washington. White, negligent, and illiterate people in Washington. They throw temper tantrums in their public, and they throw temper tantrums at international meetings where they have to behave themselves because they don't know how to behave. They're illiterates that don't know how to behave. They can only, settle scores with what? With machine gun violence. That's the way the whites of Washington, their Congress, and their presidents, settle scores. They don't talk. They machine gun the opposition. So let's, understand that they're a dangerous group of illiterates, and let's get started. So that's it. That's basically it. Please download the Google Drive link. It's in the description section. So I will, get that Google Drive link. Please download the book and read the book. So the fall of Somoza. Reports of renewed political activities by Somoza soon increased tensions between the Jeffy director and the president. The general was reportedly subsidizing an anti-administration newspaper, La Nueva Prensa, and involved in the defeat of several government measures in Congress. Under these circumstances, Minister Lane recommended against lifting the embargo on arms shipments to Nicaragua, arguing that such action would only inflame tensions. He feared that machine gun cartridges ordered by the government might be used against the Guardia, noting that the new concrete machine gun emplacements facing the Campo de Marte had just been built on La Loma. In the weeks following Sandino's death, Somoza had carefully avoided any open break with the president. But in May, the introduction of Congress of a bill providing amnesty for those involved in the murder signaled the end of this. Somoza predicted that the bill would be passed, vetoed, and then repassed, and this was exactly what happened. While the bill was being debated, the Jeffy director openly praised the killing of Sandino and admitted that he had issued orders for it. He also implied that the American minister was implicated in the murder and that he had supported Somoza's political ambitions. The angered Lane and General promised to stop making such statements, but as Lane noted, he continued making them, especially when drunk. Under these circumstances, the State Department finally authorized the issuance of a public statement disclaiming any part by the legation in Sandino's death or in the promotion of any Nicaraguan political ambitions. Again, a fraud lie by the white illiterates of Washington. In July, Somoza's ambitions were set back by the discovery of a plot within the Guardia to murder the captain Gabriel Castillo, supposedly with the support of some academia graduates, planned to lure Somoza and Colonel Antico Sacasa to Esteli and then kill them. Word of the plot leaked to Colonel Rigoberto Reyes, Guardia commander in Jinotega, and he sent word to Somoza to get Castillo to Managua on any pretext and arrest him. Castillo, 2 other captains, and 9 lieutenants suspected of involvement in the plot were arrested and tried before a secret court-martial held inside Campo del Marte. Throughout the trial, Somoza acted with considerable caution and political skill. The 11-man court-martial board was made up of academia graduates to demonstrate that the general held no prejudice against this type of officer. Castillo denied none of the charges and was sentenced to 20 years imprisonment and a dishonorable discharge. He was the only officer actually tried, but 20 others resigned following the investigation. The president attributed the plot to internal Guardia opposition to Somoza's political ambitions. Others expressed the belief that it represented continued dissatisfaction by academia graduates over the appointment of non-graduates to higher ranks. Some even claimed that General Manchada was behind the plot to dispose his erstwhile protege, while the Mexican minister felt that the whole thing might have been engineered by the president's relatives to get rid of Somoza. Somoza apparently shared this view, as he later expressed the belief that the president's relatives had indeed been behind the plot. The general now began speculating speculating on ways he might succeed Sacasa without violating the Constitution, Article 105, Title 13, of which prohibited anyone related to the incumbent president for succeeding in that office within 6 months. Somoza was affected by this since his wife was Sacasa's niece. To get around this obstacle, he considered forcing Sacasa to resign 6 months before the end of his term, amending the Constitution, or if need be, even divorcing his wife. Disciplinary problems within the Guardia provided another barrier to Somoza's ambitions. On September 12, 1935, the arsenal of the Campo del Marte again exploded. Damage was largely confined to one building used to store old ammunition, but the explosion sent the president into what the American charge described as a blue funk. The incident actually had nothing to do with Nicaraguan politics. The chief of police in Managua had hired 2 enlisted men to destroy the building in order to gain revenge in a quarrel with the Guardia's supply officer. This additional evidence of the Guardia's lack of discipline alarmed Somoza. He began to take a large party of armed troops with him whenever he went out and would eat only at the officers' club or the legation, the American legation. Many of those around Sacasa, including his wife and all of the cabinet, except the Minister of Education, put pressure on the president to remove Somoza before he gained full control of the Guardia. They accused the Jeffy director of misuse of Guardia funds, illegal campaign activities, and using the Guardia for illegal arrests and murders. They even approached the American minister in an effort to gain his support for the removal, but were turned down. Lane was no partisan of either side, feeling that neither his administration nor the Guardia were popular in Nicaragua, but he was convinced that any effort to remove Somoza would lead to civil war and ruin. While Lane's opposition stopped the plotting for a while, it did not ease the tension. Rumors of a possible Guardia coup circulated constantly, and Sacasa too began to take armed guards with him on all his travels. When he visited Leon in November, he used a special 6-car train. 2 cars were loaded with presidential guards armed with rifles, another with guards with machine guns, and the 4th with a flat car with several 3-inch mountain guns mounted on it. At every stop, soldiers cleared the public from the station before Sacasa left the train. The relative failure of this demonstration put something of a damper on Somoza's ambitions, and there was a lull in his conflict with the administration from December 1934 and until March 1935. During this period, the general concentrated on building up his support in Congress and within the Liberal Party, efforts that enjoyed considerable success. The political truce came to an end in March when pro-administration and conservative deputies joined in a congressional effort to grant amnesty to Lieutenant Lopez, the officer convicted of causing September's explosion in Campo del Marte. Lopez had originally been sentenced to death, but Somoza, at Sacasa's request, had commuted his sentence to life imprisonment. The Jeffy director was furious over the deputy's efforts to release Lopez and vowed he would never be released alive. He held a parade of troops to demonstrate Guardia support for his position, and thoroughly cowed Chamber of Deputies hurriedly rescinded He held a parade of troops to demonstrate Guardia support for his position, and a thoroughly cowed Chamber of Deputies hurriedly rescinded the amnesty decree. Victory in the dispute restored Somoza's self-confidence and revived his presidential ambitions. He now felt more confident in the Guardia's loyalty, having reorganized his staff by bringing in trusted men from outlying areas. 2 constitutional provisions, however, still barred his path to the Casa Presidencial. One was the previously mentioned provision barring any relative of the person holding the office of president during the last 6 months prior to the election from succeeding him. The other article was Article 141, which barred soldiers on active duty from obtaining office by popular election. Somoza now advocated calling a constituent assembly to remove these obstacles, a course Sacasa professed to support. Plans for the Constituent Assembly were upset in late April when the Guardia experienced yet another internal uprising. This one was led by a young academia graduate previously supported of involvement in the Castilla plot, Lieutenant Aligardo Quadra. This plot, however, bore much closer resemblance to Batista's recent revolution in Cuba than it did to earlier Guardia revolts. The similarity was picked up by the Managua press, which labeled the uprising La Batistida. Quadra had played upon enlisted discontent over recent pay cuts. He came to Managua to ask the Jeffy director to restore the former pay scale, and while there, he had managed to persuade most of the enlisted men in the 2nd Battalion to demonstrate in favor of his demands. Somoza then ordered Quadra confined to quarters, but the lieutenant managed to leave the Campo del Marte and spent the rest of the day plotting with the enlisted men in the Managua garrison and police company to revolt on the following day, April 18th. According to one account, Quadra promised the men that they could assume the rank of any officer they killed. Quadra returned to the campo on April 18th, was to be the signal for the revolt, but as usual, somebody talked to Somoza, hurried to place machine guns manned by officers at strategic points, and arrested Quadra when he walked into the campo. 20 enlisted men were also arrested and other evidently discharged. Within a few days, 65 replacements arrived for the 2nd Battalion. Quadra's court-martial almost precipitated an open conflict between Sacasa and Somoza. The court-martial board wasted little time in condemning the lieutenant to death, a sentence Somoza approved. The president, however, refused to approve the sentence, noting that the Constitution prohibited the death penalty. For a time, Somoza seemed determined to carry out the execution, but was persuaded by Lane to avoid open rebellion and to compromise on prison sentences for Quadra and the enlisted men involved in the plot. Only Lane's intervention had prevented an open clash, and Somoza's increased willingness to defy orders and precipitate such a clash alarmed Sacasa. An indecisive, frightened man, dominated by his family, he seemed unable to decide on any firm course of action. In conversations with Somoza, he appeared to favor the plan to have a constituent assembly amend the Constitution and possibly select Somoza as president without bothering with popular elections. Yet in private, he would lose his temperament and denounce the plan whenever it was mentioned. The American minister urged Sacasa to make his position clear, but had no confidence in the effect of his advice. As for the Jeffy director, Lane had come to realize that Somoza intends to be president no matter what. If he cannot reach the presidency constitutionally, he will use force to attain his end. So again, Somoza unconstitutionally achieved the presidency of Nicaragua. He's an illegitimate, illiterate president. In an effort to produce a counter-revolt to the Guardia, the president sought to create a several hundred-man civilian police force under the control of the Minister of Gobernacion. But this proposal encountered determined Guardia opposition and was abandoned, as was a project for bringing the Chilean instructors for the Guardia Nacional. Frustrated in this area, the president's supporters embarked on a campaign to have the United States assume responsibility for the post-1933 actions of the Guardia. In the fall of 1935, repeated efforts to this regard were made in both Managua and in Washington. But in every case, such efforts encountered the blunt retort that the United States had no responsibility for what the Guardia did. Such a stand was consistent with the principles of the good neighbor policy, quote unquote. But to many Nicaraguans, it seemed that the United States had created a monster, then gone off and let them try to tame it. Again, the frauds of the U.S. government. As 1935 progressed, Somoza's presidential drive intensified, despite a presidential decree forbidding any campaigning until 8 months before the election. His candidacy was formally proclaimed on September 14, 1935. At this point, Mr. Sacasa, who as Josephus Daniels had once observed, was the one who really wore the pants in the family, and who, according to Lane, harbored a deep-seated animosity towards Somoza, had wished to humiliate him at all costs, decided to take direct action. She had been secretly obtaining munitions from abroad, brought in packages marked medicine, and had gained promises from the Salvadoran and Honduran governments to cooperate in any clash with Somoza. She now proposed demanding Somoza's resignation. If he resigned, he was to be offered a post abroad, but if he resisted, planes from Honduras would bomb his headquarters, while units loyal to Sacasa would attack his supporters on the ground. These plans, which seemed to promise at the least a bloody civil war and possibly a general Central American conflict, appalled Lane. He not only refused to support Mrs. Sacasa, but obtained permission from the State Department to advise against such action. American opposition contributed to the collapse of this plan, which may have offered the last real opportunity to prevent Somoza from becoming president. The Jeffy director, by his own admission, had gone so far in his presidential campaign that he could no longer turn back. As 1936 began, the prospects for a peaceable completion of Sacasa's term of office seemed increasingly remote. Again, the U.S. government deliberately placing Somoza in place, the white frauds. At the end of 1935, Arthur Bliss Lane had learned that he would soon be transferred to the post of minister to Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Despite his increasing frustration with the situation, the American minister wanted to make a final effort to prevent the conflict between the president and the Guardia. Both Guardia headquarters and the presidential palace were being fortified in preparation for possible hostilities, and Lane was discouraged by Somoza's quite dangerous attitude, quote unquote. But nevertheless, he requested and obtained an extension of his tour in Nicaragua until March 1st, 1936, in order to make a final effort to restrain the Jeffy director. On January 30th, Sacasa asked Lane to arrange an immediate conference with him with Somoza. Lane drove the general to the Casa Presidencial, but the resulting conference produced little but mutual recriminations. The minister felt that Sacasa's hatred and distrust of Somoza poisoned the atmosphere, so he postponed the remainder of their conversations until the following day. Before the talks were resumed, Lane met privately with Somoza and persuaded him to offer to withdraw his candidacy. In the meeting with the president, however, he offered to quit as Jeffy director, not as a presidential candidate, and in making the offer, he pointedly refused to guarantee the results. The president protested that he did not want his resignation from the Guardia, then offered him an equal voice with the directorates of two historic parties in the choice of a compromised candidate. Somoza declined this responsibility, a position Lane supported, noting that it was inconsistent to ask the general to withdraw from politics and then expect him to assume responsibility for a political situation. At this point, Somoza suddenly promised to withdraw his candidacy to support the present government to guarantee the impartiality of the Guardia Nacional in the forthcoming elections and to support the candidate agreed upon by the two parties. This led Lane to praise the general for his patriotism and unselfishness. The president then promised that the two parties would agree on a candidate acceptable to the Guardia and that this candidate would guarantee Somoza's position as Jeffy director. Having apparently reached an agreement, the meeting broke up. The agreement broke down within a week. The conservatives announced that no liberal other than Somoza would be acceptable candidate, and most liberals refused to support the candidacy of any conservative. At the same time, striking chauffeurs protesting a gasoline shortage began rioting in Managua. Sacasa, who believed Somoza had fomented the strikes to further discredit his administration, ordered the Guardia to disperse the crowds and open fire if they refused to obey. Instead, Somoza managed to resolve the crisis by making a speech to the rioters, promising that the Guardia would take charge of gasoline distribution and declaring his personal determination to secure economic justice for them. His action gave him considerable popular acclaim, with some strikers demanding that he take over the government, and even La Noticia, previously opposed to his candidacy, devoting not one but two separate editorials to lauding his actions. At the same time, reports that Sacasa had ordered the Guardia to fire on the strikers spread rapidly throughout the capital, greatly increasing the unpopularity of the administration. Again, oil becomes the nexus for deception, the deception by the American government. But Sacasa and Somoza now embarked upon a campaign of mutual recriminations. Sacasa accused the general of encouraging further meetings and rallies and of failing to keep his promise to withdraw his candidacy, while Somoza in turn accused the government of failing to try to harmonize the situation and declared that he would keep his promise when the administration kept its promise to him. At this point, Arthur Bliss Lane took his final departure from Managua, being replaced as United States Minister by Boaz Long. The departure of Lane removed the last possibility of open American opposition to Somoza's seizing the presidency. The new minister, Boaz Long, was instructed to avoid taking any part in Nicaragua's domestic affairs, and was not even to engage in the efforts at mediation, which had occupied so much of his predecessor's attention. On April 30th, 1936, having found it advisable to recognize President Martinez of Salvador, and believing that applying different standards of recognition to Central American nations than those applied to the rest of Latin America was incompatible with the good neighbor policy, the United States announced the official abandonment of their policy of refusing recognition to Central American governments that came to power by revolution or other extra-legal means. That means violence. This is in 1935. This is the Roosevelt administration in 1935. This meant that Somoza could now hope for eventual recognition, no matter what means he used to take power, based on the American government stance. Within 1 month after the removal of this last American obstacle to his drive for power, Somoza resorted to violence against the incumbent administration. In March, in order to strengthen his control over the Guardia, Somoza began to replace pro-Sacasa officers with men loyal to himself. When he moved to replace the commander at Bluefields, he encountered determined presidential opposition. Somoza had charged the commanding officer there, Major Baladeras Torres, with corruption and replaced him with one of his own supporters, Major Baca. Sacasa ordered the Jeffy director to reinstate Baladeras Torres and to explain his actions in this case. Somoza promptly telegraphed to the president a large amount of alleged evidence of Torres' malfeasance in office, but refused to reinstate him despite repeated presidential demands. This open defiance of presidential authority and Sacasa's inability to do anything about it clearly illustrated the relative powers of the two men in the spring of 1936. In an effort to prevent a civil conflict, leaders of the liberal and conservative parties resumed efforts to agree on a candidate acceptable to both parties and to General Somoza. While these negotiations dragged on, Somoza continued to promise his own candidacy, announcing toward the end of April that he was a candidate for both parties' nominations. By early May, he had dropped the last pretense of withdrawing openly, informing the Nicaraguan charge to Washington that he would not accept any agreement on any other candidate. He also began to move cattle into the Campo del Marte in Nicaragua, a sure sign of impending conflict. While the Guardia provided Somoza with a potent force for the advancement of his ambitions, it did have certain limitations. For demonstrations, street brawls, and similar activities, it was less than an ideal force. To supplement the Guardia, Somoza began to support a native fascist organization, the Camisas Azules. The rather ragged group was made up of about 100 young reactionaries who hoped to set up a fascist government in Nicaragua. The Guardia provided them with guns and money and allowed them to drill openly in the streets of Managua. Late in May, they were used to burn an opposition newspaper, and an operation probably planned by the Guardia. The same month, the traditional parties finally worked out an agreement to unite on a single candidate, although they had not yet decided who that candidate would be. This agreement had the effect of excluding Somoza from the presidency in 1936, although it did include a pledge to amend the Constitution to make him eligible in 1940. Manchada urged him to reject the agreement and seize power, while Chamorro urged him to accept the bi-party plan, promising, if he did so, to work for the calling of a constituent assembly, which would make him president in 2 years. Somoza replied that he would accept the government if 3 conditions were met. He must have total control of the Guardia. He must gain control of the Foron de Casacio in Leon, and he must be named the new president. To put pressure on the government to accept the conditions, he now began using military force to replace local officials through the nation with his own supporters. He also announced of his choice for president a fellow officer and close friend, Colonel Rigoberto Reyes. The president balked at either accepting a Guardia officer as the presidential candidate or at turning over control of the fort in Leon. He asked the American minister to issue a statement supporting him, but was once more turned down. Sacasa finally decided to meet directly with Chamorro and Somoza in an effort to agree on the presidential candidate. They met on May 21st, and Somoza again proposed Reyes. When this suggestion was rejected, the Jeffy director offered Joe Jose Benito Ramirez, father-in-law of Colonel Camilo Gonzalez, and according to the American minister, a criminal. Somoza's third choice was Dr. Carlos Brancis Jaquin, physician and congressman, who was rumored to be somewhat radical. Chamorro approved this choice, but Sacasa did not, and the meeting broke up without achieving anything. The Guardian now proceeded to extend its control throughout the nation. By May 29th, local officials favorable to Somoza were in power in every major town except Managua, Rivas, and Corinto. The usual pattern was to foment a local disturbance, then have the Guardia take over and replace local officials on the pretext of maintaining order. Sacasa made numerous efforts to block such takeovers, but all to no avail. He even sent an order to all department commanders of the Guardia Nacional, stating that he had heard that they were preparing a seditious movement to remove civilian authorities and ordering them to cease any and all such actions. It was, however, too late for any such appeals to have effect. There were only two bodies of armed men whose loyalty to the president he could count on. One was the Presidential Guard, made up of political supporters from Leon, stationed at La Loma. The other was the Fortin de Acasaco, near Leon, led by his cousin, Major Ramon Sacasa. Determined to eliminate this latter force, Somoza loaded a train with packed troops and left for Leon, ostensibly to confer with Major Sacasa and to have one of his men placed in command in the Fortin. For once, the president responded to a threat with some measure of speed and decision. He and leaders of the conservatives hurriedly agreed to run. Dr. Leonardo Arguello for president and Rodolfo Espinosa for re-election as vice president. Sacasa also sent notes to the United States, Mexico, and 4 other Central American nations requesting joint action to resolve the situation produced by Somoza's actions. This appeal for foreign support, like all previous attempts, failed to produce any concrete results. In preparation for an attack on Fortin, Somoza had gathered a force of nearly 2,000 men in Leon, giving him overwhelming military superiority. On May 30th, both he and Major Sacasa sent messages to the president. Major Sacasa simply reported the situation, stating that Somoza had demanded his surrender and asking for instructions. The president ordered his court cousin to resist, declaring that national honor depended on the action. Somoza, in a message by way of the American minister, told the president he had ordered Major Sacasa to disarm the civilians and had allowed into the Fortin and replaced them with 100 Guardia regulars. The major's refusal to obey this order was characterized as a rebellion, and Somoza expressed his determination to use whatever means be necessary, quote unquote, to force his compliance. President Sacasa was asked to order his cousin to surrender to avoid bloodshed. Then the message concluded with a rather incongruous pledge to maintain you in power during your presidential term. In his reply, the president demanded that Somoza cease all efforts to alter the command of Fortin, characterizing this as a question of honor for the commanding general. The power-hungry Jeffy director Somoza and his troops were ordered to return immediately to their quarters in Managua. Somoza ignored this message and attacked the Fortin. At the same time, firing also broke out in Managua. On the morning of May 31st, firing began between Guardia machine gun positions around La Loma and the Presidential Guard, dug in around the Casa Presidencial, and also armed with machine guns. The fighting ceased briefly when Fletcher Warren, consul at the American legation, went under the American flag in both positions. For a moment, it appeared that the United States had abandoned its policy of not interfering in internal Nicaraguan politics. All Warren did, however, was to deliver to both sides a memorandum asking for protection of American lives and property. Thoroughly alarmed by the outbreak of violence, the representatives of Mexico, Honduras, El Salvador, Great Britain, and France all signed an appeal to General Somoza, asking him to avoid bloodshed and use peaceful means to resolve his dispute with the president. At this point, American insistence in non-intervention began to border on absurd, as Minister Long was instructed not to endorse the appeal in order to avoid interference in Nicaraguan affairs. Absurd is the American response characterization. The legations of the United States and the pro-Somoza government of Guatemala were the only ones that took no part in peacemaking efforts. By the late afternoon of May 31st, the president and Colonel Reyes, whom Somoza had left in command in Managua, had agreed upon an informal armistice in the capital. Fighting continued in Leon until June 2nd, when Somoza announced that if resistance continued, he would end the armistice in Managua and attack both La Loma and the Fortin simultaneously. The president then agreed to Fortin's surrender if its defenders were allowed to leave honorably. Somoza had won, and the most important remaining issue was what he would do with the president. Following this victory, Somoza made a speech pledging his loyalty to the government, announcing Sacasa would allow to finish his term under the general tutelage, but would not be permitted to thwart the will of most Nicaraguans, quote unquote, but would be, namely, Somoza's victory in the 1936 elections, which he deluded himself was the will of most Nicaraguans, the delusional fraud. It soon became clear that Sacasa had no desire to remain in office under such conditions. On June 3rd, the American minister noted the president is so nervous that he can't talk coherently and insists on only one thing, getting out of the country alive. He even asked the United States to send a special plane for him. Sacasa's supporters were also disillusioned and fearful of their own safety. Morale had collapsed among the armed men remaining on La Loma, and the president was beginning to pay them off and send them home. General Chamorro had fled to the Mexican legation, voicing the opinion that the president was more interested in protecting his relatives than fighting Somoza. Vice President Rodolfo Espinoza had no desire to oppose Somoza and let it be known that he would quit in return for $10,000 in cash and diplomatic appointments abroad for himself and his son. After some negotiations on the exact amount, he settled for $20,000, but no diplomatic positions to return for his resignation and voluntary exile. President Sacasa finally sent his formal resignation to the Congress on June 6th. In this document, he attacked the Guardia for rebelling against his authority, then announced that he was submitting an irrevocable resignation and depositing the executive power to the victor of the November 1932 elections. Since the office could not remain vacant until November, the president was assumed by the Minister of Gobernacion, Julian Arias, and Sacasa sailed for exile in El Salvador. He was destined never to return to Nicaragua. Julius Arias' term as president was very brief. Somoza made one attempt to see him, but Arias was drunk and nothing was accomplished. Steps were rapidly initiated in the Nicaraguan Congress, now completely under Somoza's control, to appoint a presidential designate to complete Sacasa's term. On June 9, 1936, the Congress proceeded obediently to select the general's personal choice, Dr. Carlos Brenes Jarquin, the interim president. Since the new administration had effective control over the entire nation, the United States decided to continue relations with it. The Jeffy director spent the next few weeks taking care of various details related to his forthcoming election to the presidency. Although Somoza was not concerned with the spirit of the law, he often tried to give at least an appearance of legality, a scruple that his son Tachito was rarely to manifest. Somoza had Congress postpone the elections until December in order that it required 6-month gap between the election and the presence of one of his relatives in the presidency would exist. The leader of the proto-fascist Caminos Azules was appointed Inspector General of Education, and the organization was disbanded since it was no longer of any real use to Somoza and showed signs of becoming troublesome. The Grand Convention of the Liberal Party, soon to be renamed Liberal Nationalist Party, was now summoned to meet in Leon. There, the party obediently nominated Anastasio Somoza G for president and Francisco Navarro for vice president. One minor obstacle, the previously named coalition ticket of Leonardo Arguello and Rodolfo Espinoza, which had obtained enough signatures to gain a place on the ballot, remained in Somoza's path to the presidency. Demonstrations in favor of these candidates were actually held in Managua and other cities under close Guardia supervision, but apparently without direct interference. The Guardia's control of the election machinery seemed to assure their defeat in November. This led to the leaders of the opposition, ex-President Chamorro, Diaz, and Sacasa, to make a last desperate effort to get the United States to stop Somoza. They all showed up in Washington and called on Summer Wells and the State Department to argue that the United States had a responsibility of the actions of the Guardia and to plead for American supervision of the upcoming election. Since the American refusal to respond to this plea virtually ensured their defeat, the leaders of the opposition decided to abstain from the elections. The actual election was rather peaceful, with the opposition boycotting the contest, although still on the ballot, and the Guardia counting the votes. Chances for an upset were non-existent. In order to remove the last constitutional barrier for his election, Somoza resigned in November as Jeffy director, and President Brenis Jarkin appointed Colonel Reyes to that post. The resignation, however, was symbolic only. Somoza dressed in civilian clothes but continued to occupy his office in the Campo del Marte and to issue orders for the Guardia, although Reyes was now had to sign them. The general also organized a puppet conservative party, which, of course, nominated him for president, making him the candidate of both liberal nationalist and the conservative nationalist parties. Preliminary returns viewed the expected landslide victory for Somoza, but the turnout was disappointingly low. On December 11th, the totals were announced at 64,000 liberal nationalists and 15,000 conservative nationalist votes for Somoza against 1,038 historic conservative and 162 constitutional liberal votes for Arguelles. Somehow by December 18th, when the Electoral Commission certified the vote, Somoza's total had grown to 86,500 and Liberation Nationale and 20,943 conservative nationalist votes. But Arguelles' support had shrunk to only 108 conservative and 61 constitutional liberal votes. Following the lead of a United States-created sister organization, the Dominican Republic, the Guardia had elevated its leader into the nation's highest office. The General Somoza now moved rapidly to reestablish himself as Jeffy director of the National Guard. On December 16th, he announced that Rigoberto Reyes would be promoted to brigadier general and made minister of war in the incoming cabinet. This created a vacancy in the post of Jeffy director. 2 days later, it was announced that presidential-elect Anastasia Somoza Garcia had assumed that position. With his inauguration as president on January 1st, 1937, the two positions were combined in the person of one individual, giving him unprecedented power. The rule of Somoza had officially begun in Nicaragua. It would endure longer than anyone might reasonably have predicted. The action of General Somoza in using the Guardia to elevate himself into the presidency was hardly contemplating the original American objectives in establishing this force. Much of the credit or blame for the transformation of what it was intended as to be a non-political, or into the words of Arthur Bliss Lane, the major political power in Nicaragua, must go to Somoza. He had proved himself a shrewd, energetic, skillful, and amoral politician capable of combining diplomacy with force, threat, and rewards. His personal charm had influenced the host of most important figures in the final struggle for power. Even such veteran caudillos as ex-President Chamorro Moncada had proved too much for the Guardia's Jeffy director. The weakness of the Sacasa regime was another important factor in Somoza's rise to power. The administration was riddled with corruption. The president was weak, indecisive, and dominated by grasping, short-sighted group of relatives. All of this meant that the president's popularity declined constantly during his term in office, costing him much of the potential strength of the ongoing conflict with the Guardia. Finally, it must be remembered that Sacasa himself had worked to convert the Guardia into a partisan political force. It was only when he realized that this force could be used against him that the president began to call for enforcement of those agreements designed to make the Guardia non-political. The major share of the responsibility for Somoza's seizure to power, however, must rest with the United States. Such responsibility is due more than the American influence to Somoza's appointment as Jeffy director and the latter refusal of the United States to later refusal of the United States to take any responsibility for his actions. Its roots go back to the original concept of creating a supposedly nonpartisan constabulary in Nicaragua and its drive to ensure political and financial stability in Nicaragua. The United States insisted upon the creation of the Guardia. It was assumed that by breaking the ties between the political leaders and the military and by giving both officers and men professional training and status, revolutions would be discouraged, fiscal responsibility advanced, and democracy made possible. The United States failed to realize that the traditional army in Nicaragua had developed in response to local conditions and political realities. Any attempt to create an honest, non-political military force without changing the nation's basic social and economic situation was probably impossible. Nicaragua suffered from economic underdevelopment, concentration of wealth, mass illiteracy, strong regionalism, and weak nationalism. The original conception of the Guardia bore no relationship to any of these realities. As early as 1926, Charles Eberhard, American minister of Nicaragua, realized that the time has not yet come, if it ever will, when a nonpartisan constabulary or National Guard organized under American ideas or ideals will be a success in Nicaragua. It is not wanted. It is not wanted. The State Department wanted it. Foreign investors wanted it. But Nicaragua's politicians did not want it. Sandino supporters certainly did not want it. And the great majority of the population was completely indifferent to it. Those in power were happy to have a well-trained disciplined force in place of an old, unreliable political army, but they wanted complete control over the new force, making it an instrument of their political power, just as the old army had been. Those out of power might have wanted a nonpartisan Guardia, but they did not want a strong and efficient one, as that one present too great an obstacle for its future revolution. Under such circumstances, the change from a nonpartisan to a bipartisan Guardia Nacional was at least an effort to bring the Guardia partly into line with the Nicaraguan political realities. By making the president and the Jefe director members of the same party, it was thought that the Guardia would at least support the government. Nicaraguan political parties, however, were predominantly vehicles for elevating certain individuals or groups of individuals to power, and not unified bodies sharing common ties of loyalty and ideology. Ambitious generals had repeatedly used their troops against the incumbent president. In the past, the president often won such struggles because of the poor state of the armed forces, but the Guardia was a stronger force than Nicaragua had ever known. Its creation had given the nation its first professional military caste with special interests separate from those of the nation as a whole. Presidential efforts to control the Guardia often conflicted with these interests, while the Jefe director could usually pose as their defender. To prevent such conflicts during his reign, General Somoza continued as Jefe's director, not relinquishing the post until the 1950s, when he appointed his own West Point-trained son, Tachito, to succeed him. The failure of the American effort to create a non-political constabulary Nicaragua was summarized in July 1935 letter from Arthur Bliss Lane to Willard Buell. Lane characterized the Guardia as a Nicaraguan North American hybrid, which constituted the biggest stumbling block to the progress of Nicaragua. He attacked its absorption of over half the government's revenues and ridiculed the idea that it could guarantee free elections when its commander was an avowed candidate. Lane summed the problem by saying, "The people who created the Guardia Nacional had no adequate understanding of the psychology of the people here. Otherwise, they would not have bequeathed Nicaragua with an instrument to blast constitutional procedure off the map. Did it ever occur to the eminent statements who created the GN that personal ambition lurks in the human breast, even in Nicaragua? In my opinion, in one of the sorriest example on our part of our inability to understand that we should not meddle in other people's affairs." Lane's basic points are quite accurate. For the Guardia to have worked the way the State Department thought it should, Nicaragua would have had to experience a transformation in its political, economic, and social, as well as military character. The attempts to impose an American solution on the Nicaraguan problem had destroyed, not promised, promoted democratic government. Again, destroyed democratic government. Whether it would produce for the United States the stability which it ardently desired remained to be seen. So that's the chapter. Very, very important chapter. But, I'm going to make some, basic comments. So, Somoza, he took power violently. There were constitutional provisions saying that Somoza could not become the president. He was related to the president in charge. So, the machine guns that the U.S. government supplied were used to make his dream come true. It was a machine gun group of thugs, machine gun, approach to, democracy, machine gun and, violence to the sake of the presidency. That's the first thing we discussed. The second thing we talked about is that, Somoza was, a character. He was a character. He was a fraud. He was a deceit. He was a liar. He was a murderer. I'm not sure what Richard Millett is really reading in many of the things, but it's pretty straightforward. Somoza is a criminal. He's a fraud. He's a murderer. He's a rapist, and he's a butcher. He is not anything, charming. He is not charming. He is not rational. He is not logical. He is not, anything that he described. He described many traits of Somoza that were flattering traits. Somoza is a criminal. Somoza is a fraud, a deceitful liar, a murderer, and a butcher, and a rapist. That is what Somoza is. That is what we can see. And the U.S. government, multiple times, Sukasa appealed to the U.S. government, multiple times, they went to the U.S. government and said that this guy is not working. The question is whether the U.S. government actually deliberately planted Somoza there to take power violently like this. That is definitely a question that comes up in my mind when I read this stuff, and it's analyzed in such a one-sided, skewed way, as if it's a of propaganda that the U.S. government is issuing. There's no question that Somoza was, directly responsible for his own, elevation to the presidency. He unconstitutionally took power. He was an illegal president of Nicaragua. He's illegal and not even acknowledged he should not have even been acknowledged by the United States. But the rest of the world didn't acknowledge him because that is what he is. He was a violent criminal that took presidency by the force of law, similar to all the violent criminals like Batista and all the other white racist interventions of the United States that take power in Latin America. They don't belong there, again, because their approach is machine gun, for the success and the presidency. Machine gun your way. They're illiterate whites. They're negligent whites. They don't, watch after their, interventions, and they provide themselves with, the facade that they're interested when they're actually negligent white, racists and murderous butchers. So that's what we saw. So Somoza did not deserve to be president. He was, a thug. He was a criminal. He was a common criminal. He was responsible for all the murderous, actions in Nicaragua. And, his, delusions, his creating his own delusions in his mind that somehow he, was allowed to be president and, he was going to be better than the other presidents. He was all over the place. So we're going to just go through a few things here that specifically we talked about. All right, so, basically, he implied that the American minister was implicated in the murder and that he supported Somoza's political ambitions. So he praised, after Jeffy director openly praised the killing of Sandino and admitted that he had issued the orders for it. Okay, then Sacasa said that, the American minister was implicated in the murder and that he supported Somoza's political ambitions. I agree with that. The American minister and the American government were interested in murdering Sandino. That's definite. There's no question about that. So they go down as the criminal thugs, the liar, frauds, and deceitful thugs. The murderous butcher whites of Washington go down for the vicious, murder of Sandino. So basically, Elaine, and then the circumstances, the State Department made some, fraudulent propaganda that they had nothing to do with it. So after that, we talked about his wife and all of his cabinet of Sacasa, except Minister of Education, put pressure on the president to remove Somoza before he gained full control over the Guardia. They accused the Jeffy director of misuse of the Guardia funds, illegal campaign activities, and using the Guardia for illegal arrests and murders. They even approached the American minister in an effort to gain his support for the removal, but were turned down. So why would Lane turn them down if he's abusing the privilege of the Guardia? Because Lane is a fraud. He's another white fraud of the U.S. government. Has no idea what is actually happening. He's complicit in Somoza's taking power here. It's a complete fraud, and it's just a subversion, a U.S. destabilization campaign in Nicaragua so they can have a fascist military director in power. So we're continuing on. Keep going. Here we go. So then we're going to talk about. So then we talked about basically, according to one account, Quadra promised the men that they could assume the rank of army officer and be killed. Quadra's return to the campo was to be a signal for revolt. Okay, so Quadra's court-martial precipitated an open conflict between Sacasa and Somoza. Quadra was the one that was imprisoned, by Somoza for having, threatened or, trying to get rid of Somoza. The court-martial board wasted no time in condemning the lieutenant to death and a sentence that Somoza approved. The sentence constitution prohibited the death penalty. Somoza seemed determined to carry out the execution, but he was persuaded by Lane to avoid an open rebellion and to compromise on prison sentences for Quadra and enlisted men. So basically, Somoza didn't listen to Sacasa. Sacasa had no power. So, this author, Richard Millett, he reads the stuff, he presents some of the facts, but the fact is he doesn't really question his details. He doesn't question his details. He doesn't really read this stuff the way, the normal person would read this stuff. He has a little bit of a literacy issue, just like the U.S. government, politicians, they're bureaucrats. They have a literacy issue. They throw temper tantrums instead of reading the actual stuff. Basically, in summary, the bottom line is that Somoza, the fact that he doesn't listen to Sakasa means that he's a subversive. He's not, interested in the government. He's not interested in pursuing, any kind of democratic ideas. He's interested in not serving any government. He's not really serving the government. He's serving his own interests. Somoza was self-serving himself. He was serving his own machine gun violence and his, own money, cash, hunger. He's he's a thug. He's like a mafia thug, like the white supremacists of the U.S. government. That's ultimately what it is. So then, basically, Somoza's presidential basically, such a stand was consistent with so basically in the fall of 1935, repeated efforts in this regard were made in both Managua and in Washington, but in every case, such efforts encountered the blunt retort that the United States had no responsibility for what the Guardia did. Such a stand was consistent with the principles of the good neighbor policy, but to many Nicaraguans, it seemed that the United States had created a monster, then gone off and left them to try to tame it. So yeah, they put Somoza in power. They created this monster, criminal, and then they tried, to have them tamed. This is the same thing. They are white murderous butchers. They're racist murderers and white supremacist butchers of the U.S. government. Their action in Nicaragua, again, reflects their illiteracy, their failed thought process, their negligence, their criminal insanity, and their, lack of the ability to read the information that's given. They, delude themselves with stories that are not really present. That's what the U.S. government does. They delude themselves with stories. Basically, so Lane, there was a rebellion against, Somoza. A pretty straightforward thing. The people didn't like Somoza. They wanted to rebel against him. I think it was a good idea. But, basically Lane, made it clear to the United States that, there was a rebellion plan. And, basically they, quashed it. They quashed it from the outside. So basically, again, the United States government getting involved in Nicaraguan politics, even though it puts its hands halfway out, it's, remotely involved itself through its illiterate whites in Washington, its, negligent, group of thugs that sit in the Congress and the U.S. administration. So continuing on, the departure of Lane removed so Lane was removed. So basically, the President Martinez, on April 30th, having found it advisable to recognize President Martinez of Salvador and believing that applying different standards of recognition to Central American nations than those applied to the rest of Latin America was incompatible with the good neighbor policy, the United States announced the official abandonment of their policy of refusing recognition to Central American governments that came to power through violence. So ultimately, the U.S. removed that, little caveat that it wouldn't recognize, governments that came to violence. I see in this kind of a conspiracy by the U.S. government, the murderous butchers, the racist, murderous anti-Hispanic butchers, and their, vicious campaign in Latin America. They didn't respect the indigenous people, and they wanted to, basically abandon their policy of not recognizing governments that came to violence. Just wishy-washy, today it works this way, tomorrow it works this way. That's how Washington works. It is, illiterate, they don't know how to take a stand. Their principles are, fabricated. They're, deceive themselves, and they delude themselves into their goodness when they're evil, murderous butchers. So continuing on, finishing up, basically, the Guardia, Somoza, we talked about the fascist organization. Somoza, was, consulting a fascist organization because he didn't think there was enough of control. And then, basically, those are the things there. And then we came to the power-hungry Jeffy director and his troops were ordered to return immediately. Basically, Somoza was, going to take part in violence. He was going to create an uprising. He, went to, get rid of Major Sacasa in Fortin. And, he was asked to return. He didn't follow any orders. He didn't listen to the government of Nicaragua. The president is the official leader of Nicaragua, has no power because Somoza is a power-hungry monster that the U.S. put there because they are murderous butchers and they sought to murder the Nicaraguan people. So basically, Sacasa was chased out of Nicaragua, and ultimately, that was the end. And basically, finally, Somoza, as Jeffy director, Somoza was, placed in power illegally. Basically, he illegally came to power. He unconstitutionally was ruler of Nicaragua, and he was, done. So President Somoza. In his inaugural address, President Somoza lauded the accomplishments of the Guardia Nacional. He promised to improve its equipment and training, including the training of officers, and to separate the police from the military portions of the Guardia, although both would continue under the same command, that of the Jeffy director Somoza. A month after his inauguration, he began to act on this program, asking the American legation for aid in obtaining instructors to help reopen the Academia Militaire. Since the withdrawal of the Marines, there had been no regular means for training new officers, and as a result, the force had deteriorated. The State Department was willing to consider Somoza's request for American instructors, but felt that action on this matter should be postponed for the president until it became clear how the new president was doing in office. For the first few months, the new president did not seem to be doing at all well. The continuing world depression had badly damaged the Nicaraguan economy. Somoza was forced to devalue the Cordoba, and this pushed up the cost of living, resulting in worker unrest. Discontent was also reportedly affecting the Guardia. One captain even dared to make speech highly critical of the president in his presence, accusing him of neglecting the force. The officer was immediately discharged, but many observers saw the incident as a sign that the presidency was too much for Somoza. His former mentor, President Manchada, shared this view, openly stating, "The young man on the hill will not last later than next July." Helping to stifle dissent, Somoza began using his armed forces to crack down on the opposition. The Guardia raided a conservative party gathering ostensibly held to celebrate the birthday of exiled General Emiliano Chamorro and imprisoned 56 of those present. The press was ordered not to mention this incident, and after a day or two, those arrested were released with a small fine for disturbing the peace. The public display of control over the Guardia and a willingness to use it against political opposition stemmed, for a time, the open plotting against the new administration. Somoza followed up this advantage rapidly, demonstrating the political skill that helped bring him to power. He obtained Manchada's public support, in return for which he had the government give the ex-president 2 automobiles and had National Bank buy up his devalued interest in some Nicaraguan utilities. The press was subject to an informal censorship maintained largely through the open threat of repression. The Guardia's duties were expanded to include the control of internal revenue and the National Railroad. It also organized an intelligence service, concentrating its efforts on domestic dissidents. These actions virtually destroyed public opposition, although private resentment over the Guardia's increased power and consequent arrogance probably increased. By July 1937, even Dr. Leonardo Arguello, his opponent in the 1936 elections, was helping to create a commerce to unify the Liberal Party around Somoza. Guardia functions were continually expanded throughout the year. Control over the postal service and over immigration and emigration was tightened. Military control over all imports of guns and ammunition was firmly established, and even commercial companies had to obtain a special Guardia permit to import dynamite for their operations. Finally, the Direction General de Sanidad, the National Sanitation Service, was placed under military control. The combined effect of these actions was to give the Guardia an awesome amount of power. It was the nation's only armed force, including all police and even customs inspector within its ranks. It controlled the postal telegraph and internal radio services, operated an extensive domestic intelligence service, and controlled the importation and sale of all arms and explosives. No one could enter or leave the country or even start a business without Guardia permission. It was rapidly becoming apparent that as long as he had the support of the Guardia, any effort to overthrow Somoza would probably be an exercise in futility. As promised in his inaugural address, Somoza had also begun efforts to improve the Guardia's equipment. A major project in this area was his effort to create an air force. He announced plans for a school to train military pilots and purchased 4 airplanes. The activity in this minuscule force were badly hampered by a lack of pilots. There was only one man to fly all 4 aircraft. The Guardia had a total strength of 1937 of 201 line officers, 8 medical officers, and 2,237 enlisted men, 89 urban police, and 390 auxiliaries. While this force was large by Central American standards, the Guardia's varied non-military functions severely limited the force available to meet any revolutionary threat. Somoza's solution to this was to create a Guardia Reserve made up of former Guardia and other politically reliable citizens. In case of conflict, the force could assume police and other non-military duties, freeing large numbers of troops for combat duty. Throughout 1937, President Somoza had continued to press for American assistance in reopening the Academia Militar, By mid-August, the United States had indicated a willingness to make one officer available and accept $300 per month compensation, $200 per month less than Guatemala was paying for similar services. This offer was suddenly withdrawn in October. A renewal of Nicaragua's border dispute with Honduras caused the State Department to suspend action on the project until the crisis passed. The border dispute had roots reaching back almost a century. The latest controversy resolved around Nicaragua's issuance of a stamp that showed the territory awarded to Honduras in 1906, following arbitration by King Alfonso XIII of Spain, and still disputed. In August, both sides had rushed troops to the border, and war was narrowly avoided. Nicaraguan troops remained in the area for the remainder of the year, asserting Nicaraguan claims in the area and preventing illegal immigration from Honduras. The only other significant military operation undertaken in the Guardia in 1937 involved the elimination of Pedro Altamirano, the last of Sandino's generals. Pedron, as he was popularly known, had increased his activities in 1937, sacking a coffee plantation and briefly seizing the small town of Palpunta on the Coco River. 3 Guardia agents and 2 Managua prostitutes recruited by the Guardia managed to infiltrate Pedron's hand. One of the prostitutes persuaded Pedron to leave his family and spend the night with her. While he was asleep, the Guardia agents cut off his head and brought it back to Managua. This ended more than 10 years after it began the warfare between the Guardia and the original followers of Sandino. The year 1938 proved a remarkably peaceful one, or at least by Nicaraguan standards. The elimination of Pedron meant that there was virtually no fighting in the nation. Despite continued economic problems, Somoza remained firmly in power. For the Guardia, the most significant event in 1938 was probably the founding of the Fuerzas Aéreas de Nicaragua, FAN, an integral part of the Guardia Nacional. The previous year, 2 Guardia officers, Captains Guillermo River Quadra and Rafael Espinoza Altamirano, had gone to Canada for aviation instruction. While there, they purchased 2 4-passenger Waco biplaners. An attempt to fly these to Nicaragua almost ended in a disaster, as one of the planes blew a tire and was held up in Belize, while Captain Rivas Quadra flew the other into a hangar, wrecking the plane, though miraculously not injuring himself. Despite such setbacks, General Somoza persisted in his efforts to develop an air force. He and his wife, who had been proclaimed godmother of the Air Force, inaugurated permanent headquarters for FAN, and several officers were assigned to aviation duties. FAN's subsequent career was far from smooth. Several aircraft were destroyed in a variety of mishaps, including one lost when Captain Quadra landed it without bothering to lower the landing gear. By 1939, the force was in such desperate straits that Somoza considered selling all but one of its planes to a commercial company, which in turn would train future FAN pilots. The report led by the United States to turn down a request for an aviation instructor. The planes were never sold, but shortages of funds limited each plane to about 1 hour per week in the air, and the Guardia was forced to have its pilots trained by serving co-pilots and with TACHA, the Salvadoran national airline. It would take American aid during World War II to make an effective force out of FAN. For most of the Guardia, the most important event in 1938 was probably the increase in their pay, ranging from 50% for privates to 30% for high officers. Somoza was responsible for these increases, which were part of a growing series of paternalistic benefits conferred on the Guardia in return for the force's loyalty and cooperation in maintaining the general to office. The efforts were made to start a Nicaraguan Navy. A small 15-year-old cutter was purchased from the United States Coast Guard for $1,500. It had no radio and was rather dubious condition. It was considered delivering it to Nicaragua deck cargo, but shipping costs would have been 3 times the purchase price. The Navy's finally agreed to tow the craft to Corinto, where it arrived in November 1938. On board was Chief Boatswain's mate Alan L. Lundquist, whom the Coast Guard had agreed to assign to Nicaragua for 6 months to train Somoza's Navy. Lundquist's mission was something less than complete success. He spent more than a year in Nicaragua. He spent more than a year in Nicaragua, during which time the boat left the harbor only 4 times, cracked a cylinder head, and filled up with cockroaches. By September 1939, the boatswain was warning that if the boat were not repaired, it might well sink at the dock. Some of Lundquist's problems were due to the friction within the Guardia. Somoza was determined that all Nicaraguan armed forces Army, police, Air Force, and Navy should be part of the Guardia. Some officers disagreed and opposed all plans for a Navy. Having little desire to sail out to sea on a cockroach-infested cutter, they refused to cooperate with Lundquist, leading the American minister to suggest that no more boats be sold to Nicaragua. His Air Force might fly into hangars and his Navy fill up with cockroaches, but none of this affected Somoza's design on long-term career in the Casa Presidencial. In 1939, he pushed through Congress a measure calling for a constituent assembly. Delegates were elected in November and met in December, dissolving Congress and assuming the powers of government. The conservatives boycotted the elections, allowing Somoza to dominate the assembly without resorting to force or fraud. By February, the puppet assembly had already had an 11,000-word draft to consider, and 7 weeks later, Nicaragua was presented with its constitution of 1939. This document provided for a 6-year presidential term with no re-election. A loophole in Article 350, however, exempted the incumbent president from this prohibition. Articles 335 and 343 dealt with the National Guard. The Guardia was to be the sole armed forces of the Republic, and any other armed forces of Nicaragua were automatically placed under its jurisdictions. Army members were supposed to be non-political and were not allowed to vote, run for office, or criticize the laws of the nation. Complete control over the Guardia was vested in the president, who, without congressional approval, could issue all the laws and regulations for it. After adopting the Constitution, the Assembly became a legislative body, replacing the Congress until May 1st, 1947. The new Congress then chose Anastasia Somoza G as president for the period from 1939 to 1947. It was obvious to everyone that the general had moved into the Casa Presidencial to stay. When the Guardia was under control, with the Guardia under control and the opposition divided and disorganized, Somoza began to look abroad. Unlike his predecessors, he visited several foreign countries while still in office, when even traveling to Honduras, despite the continuing border dispute. From both a personal and propaganda viewpoint, the high points of his travels came in 1939, when President Franklin Roosevelt invited him to visit the United States. Somoza made extensive preparations for this trip. His Minister of War, General Rigoberto Reyes, assumed control over the Guardia and took up the residence in the Casa Presidencial, along with Colonel Louis de Bale and General Gustavo Abanza. Congress was sent on a prolonged vacation, providing still further evidence of the administration's reliance upon and identification with the Guardia Nacional. In the United States, the Nicaraguan dictator received a full red carpet treatment. He had several long conferences with President Roosevelt and leading figures of his administration. Discussions covered economic matters, proposals for canalization of the San Juan River, and Somoza's continued desire to obtain American instructors for the Academia Militar. The treatment, recorded Somoza, produced a storm of protest among Nicaraguan exiles, but this had no observable effect on the United States government. The visit ended with an exchange of letters between the two presidents. Somoza repeated his desire for economic aid in creating a large canal along the San Juan River. He again repeated his request to have an American Army officer detailed to act as director of the military academy. In reply, Roosevelt agreed to have the Army engineers undertake studies of both canal and highway projects for linking the east and west coasts of Nicaragua, and promised that the Army would assign a qualified officer to act as a director of the military academy of the Nicaraguan National Guard. The decision to assign an officer to the Academia represented the culmination of long-standing negotiation and was not a departure of American policy. The previous December, Under Secretary of State Sumner Welles had decided that the situation with Honduras had quieted sufficiently to allow the United States to provide the Academia with a director. The following month, the War Department informed the State Department that it would furnish an officer for that position as soon as it received a formal request. Major Charles Mullins was elected for this assignment. Before departing for Nicaragua in the summer of 1939, he called upon the State Department and was told to stay in close touch with the American legation and be guided by it in his relations with the Nicaraguan government. The new American director faced immense problems. The building proposed for the Academia lacked beds, sanitary facilities, and space for drill instruction, and had no offices or library. Furthermore, Somoza was now talking about simply establishing a 6-month refresher course instead of the regular 4-year cadet training program that Mullins and the State Department had envisioned. Somoza was finally convinced to set up a regular academy modeled after the one in Guatemala. By the end of October, Mullins had received 250 applications for the 50 spaces in the first class. Classes were begin on January 20th, 1940. By the end of 1940, General Somoza was already pressing to have Mullins' appointment extended beyond its original 2-year term. Pleased with the academia's progress, he had made the American director a brigadier general in the Guardia and was paying him $385 per month in addition to his regular army salary. Despite some American misgivings, Mullen was reappointed for an additional year, and another officer, Captain William Bunker, was sent to join him and give engineering lectures. The Academia Militare could now offer a 3-year course in basic military subjects, filling the dangerous gap in officer training that had existed since the withdrawal of the Marines. American efforts to aid in the construction of a large canal along the San Juan River proved much less successful, and ultimately the project was abandoned. In its place, the United States proposed to construct a road to Rama, linking the west coast with the headwaters of the Escondido River, which could then be navigated to the east coast port of Bluefields. Brigadier General Dwight Eisenhower approved this project, estimating the cost of $2 million and declaring that it would be of a definite military value in hemispheric defense. His recommendation was adopted, but by June 1942, the estimated cost had risen to $4,500,000. The cost continued to rise for over 20 years until the road was finally completed in the mid-1960s. Then it had become for many a classic case of American mismanagement and poor planning in foreign aid. A final result of the visit to the United States was the growth of a legend linking Roosevelt and Somoza in a close friendship. Somoza carefully cultivated this legend, expressing his friendship for Roosevelt, often and loudly, often declaring a 2-day national holiday when the American president was reelected in 1940. He also sent an endless stream of flattering messages to Roosevelt, and in 1942 honored the American president's birthday by renaming Managua's Main Street Avenida Roosevelt. Most Nicaraguans believed that there were close ties between the two presidents, a belief which undoubtedly inhibited opposition to the dictator. In reality, once he returned to Nicaragua, Somoza was virtually forgotten by Roosevelt, who usually handed his messages of congratulation and friendship over to an aide for reply. The presidency gave Somoza more than power and prestige. In his first 3 years in office, he accumulated a fortune estimated at from $3 to $4 million, a record no previous Nicaraguan president had even approached. He had even taken $185,000 for expenses during his visit to the United States. Somoza had become wealthy in a variety of ways. He demanded a tribute to 1.5 cents per pound on exported cattle. Contributions were exacted from various industries, such as mining and textiles. All government employees were forced to contribute 5% of their salaries to the Liberal Party. General Somoza then drew upon these funds as if they constituted a personal bank account. Much of this new wealth was invested in acquiring property in Nicaragua. The general almost never stole land, preferring to buy it from the legal owner. The dictator would simply drive up to a house and offer the owner a price, usually almost half the real value for his land. Often the owner would accept the offer, finding discretion the better part of valor, or would even offer it as a gift to Somoza, hoping to gain some political reward in return. Any owner who did not want to sell found himself faced with a campaign of harassment, tax increases, and similar measures until he finally gave in. The general also brought up underdeveloped land, then had the government build a road to it or dredge out a new harbor in its vicinity. Under such techniques, he soon became the wealthiest man in Nicaraguan history. Graft was common in Nicaragua, but Somoza refined and systematized it. Emboldened by the example of their leader, the officers and men of the Guardia used their positions, especially in customs, immigration, and police, to enrich themselves. They even engaged in wholesale cattle smuggling. The corruption extended from the Minister of War, General Reyes, to the private on the street who would demand, "Pay me 5 Cordobas or be arrested." The rural population came to fear the Guardia, claiming that the local soldiers, who were also the rural police, could simply walk into their homes and take anything, leaving them no possible redress. All of this alienated the Guardia from the civilian population, making them a separate military caste, loyal only to their leader, not to the nation as a whole. They did manage to maintain a high degree of internal order and stability, but the average citizen found them paying an ever increasing price for these benefits. The preoccupation with graft cut sharply into efficiency, and by March 1940, the American legation felt that only the 2 companies of the Presidential Guard had any potential for combat. Alarmed by this, Somoza began to seek possible American aid for a total reorganization of the Guardia. The American minister informed the State Department that if we wanted to maintain Somoza in power or to avoid outbreak of revolution shortly within Nicaragua, we would have to provide such services. The State Department, however, was not anxious to bolster the Nicaraguan dictator's sagging prestige and instructed the American legation to avoid any intimation that such appointments would be desired by the United States. Failing to secure American aid, Somoza set out to reorganize the Guardia on his own. In the fall of 1940, when General Reyes went to Washington to attend a meeting of Western Hemisphere Chief of Staffs, the shakeup began. Somoza burst into the Campo del Marte, searched various officers' desks, and transferred most of the arms in the Campo to the presidential palace. The general staff was overhauled, with Colonel Medina hurriedly promoted from major, replacing Reyes as chief of staff. 8 officers were arrested, 4 discharged, and 20 others suddenly transferred. General Reyes knew nothing about the affair until his return from Washington. He was met at the Managua airport by chief of police. Somoza demanded and obtained his prompt resignation from the Guardia, reportedly telling Reyes that he should be court-martialed and shot. The dictator offered a variety of explanations for his actions, including charges that Reyes tapped his phones, had failed to carry out orders, was influenced by pro-Nazi elements, and was guilty of graft and corruption, a rather odd charge for Somoza to make against anyone else. These actions revealed 2 Somoza tactics which, with considerable success, he would employ repeatedly in coming years. First, any officer whose popularity or power made him seem a potential threat was quite likely to find himself suddenly transferred, retired, or discharged. Those who accepted this treatment without protest often found themselves later restored to a measure of favor. Prison and death were generally reserved for those who actually attempted to overthrow the president. The other tactic was the identification of all opposition, actual or potential, with whatever foreign threat currently preoccupied the United States. In the 1940s, this was the Nazi movement. Later, it would be the communists. Throughout 1941, United States concern over the defense of the Western Hemisphere continued to increase. An October 1941 Lend-Lease agreement promised Nicaragua $1,300,000 in military equipment from the United States at a deferred cost of $900,000. Even before this agreement was signed, General Somoza had submitted a detailed request for the $300,000 worth of equipment promised for the coming year. He asked for 100 machine guns, 15 BAR, 15 submachine guns, 100 rifles, 1 Waco airplane, 125 fragmentation bombs, and large quantities of supplies and ammunition. Colonel Mullins strongly endorsed this request. As early as June 1941, he had been urging American aid to the Guardias so that neither expatriate Nicaraguans nor resident Nazis make any kind of diversion for the United States in this country, and pointing out that the needs of Nicaragua are immediate if we are to get this army in condition to be of any material assistance. Nicaragua's armed forces never fired a single shot against the Axis armed forces, but Lend-Lease work provided them enough equipment to ensure their continued domination of the domestic political scene. Nicaragua declared war on Japan on December 9, 1941, and on Germany and Italy 2 days later. During the war, an American naval base was constructed at Corinto, and an air base was also built in the Republic. A seaplane base and coast artillery unit were established at Corinto, and Nicaragua's tiny navy received several small patrol boats from the United States and took over some patrol duties along its coast. The Guardia's air arm was also built up, receiving numerous aircraft under the Lend-Lease agreement. FAN claimed a total of almost 40 aircraft by the end of the conflict. These were used in coastal patrols and in flying American and Nicaraguan officers around the nation. General Somoza used the war as an excuse for declaring a state of siege and suspending constitutional guarantees. Under these conditions, the conservatives were barred from holding any political meetings on the pretext that such activities didn't promote Nicaraguan interests during the war. During the war, there was at least one significant dispute between General Somoza and the American military. This involved Colonel Mullins, the Academia Militaris director, who had grown increasingly disillusioned with Somoza's rule. When in May 1942, the president sent the colonel a bill for $3,336, which he claimed the Academia owed for electricity, Mullins returned a check for the amount made payable to Somoza, clearly implying that the Jeffy director would pocket the money. The Nicaraguan dictator immediately asked that Mullins be replaced, and the request was granted. Colonel Fred Cruz became the Academia's new director. In December 1943, he was replaced by Colonel Leroy Bartlett. Under Colonel Bartlett, the Academia's cadets began the practice, continued ever since, of traveling to Panama to spend their senior year receiving instruction from American officers at Fort Bulig. By the end of 1943, General Somoza had already begun considering ways of altering the Constitution to permit his re-election in 1947. These efforts led to a split in January 1944 convention of the Liberal Party. A large faction led by General Carlos Passos opposed any plan for re-election, but the dictator used the Guardia to confine the dissidents to their homes and push his plans through the convention. The opposition then formed their own political party, the Partido Liberal Independiente. Encouraged by the fall of long-standing dictatorship and General Martinez in El Salvador and Ubico in Guatemala, Nicaraguan university students and opposition political groups began to demonstrate against Somoza in the summer of 1944. The Guardia remained loyal, but many Liberal Party leaders, including ex-President Manchada, were alarmed by the strength of the opposition and began to urge the president to renounce all plans to succeed himself. Instead, Somoza closed the National University, and this precipitated the protest resignation of his Minister of Education. In an effort to enlist American support for a sagging regime, General Somoza announced plans to stage a military parade, ostensibly in honor of the United States on July 4th, and asked American permission to deliver a speech from the embassy's balcony. The State Department turned down the request to use the balcony, but could not prevent Somoza from making further efforts to identify his regime with the United States. A few days later, when his opponents attempted to launch a general strike, a tactic which had played a key role in the fall of Ubico and Martinez, the president succeeded in having Colonel Lindbergh, the American president of the Junta de Control de Precios de Comercio, sign an order announcing that any establishment that closed its doors would be seized and its goods sold and be denied the right to engage in business. Any foreigner who joined the strike would be subject to deportation. The threatened strike collapsed, but Somoza's difficulties were far from over. Pressures against Somoza's re-election continued to mount during July. An exile publication from El Salvador devoted considerable space to attacking Somoza's corruption of the Guardia, declaring that Somoza had replaced academia graduates with political supporters, refused to punish the military for any crimes against civilians, and given control of gambling and other illegal activities to Guardia officers. Student agitation increased, opposition from within the Liberal Party also grew, and even some Guardia officers began to express doubts about the wisdom of general plans for his own re-election. The Puppet Congress ignored these protests and passed an amendment legalizing re-election, but fearing that the continued protests might lead to his own overthrow, Somoza reluctantly vetoed this measure. Agitation continued for another month until the president also agreed to amnesty for those arrested in earlier demonstrations. With these concessions, General Somoza managed to avoid the fate of Generals Ubico and Martinez. His control over the Guardia had been shaken by these events, however, and by November, even his most loyal supporters were reporting discontent, especially among the enlisted men. In an effort to strengthen his position, Somoza began early in 1945 a campaign to increase aid and support from the United States. In addition to requesting arms and supplies, he invited several American officers to Nicaragua, presented them with medals, and even made them honorary members of the Nicaraguan Air Force. A conversation between the American charge in Nicaragua and one of these officers, Brigadier General Luther Smith, chief of the military missions section of the Caribbean Defense Command, revealed American motives for participating in such ceremonies. The charge pointed out that the critical role of the Guardia in Nicaraguan politics, noting that Somoza would doubtless be interested in improving his National Guard by any and every means at his disposal. He added that Somoza would probably remain in command of the Guardia even if he stepped down after as president after the next elections, then concluded by urging the army not to burden the country with armaments. General Smith, in reply, voiced the War Department's determination that military missions from foreign countries in the Americas should be avoided at all costs, adding that the War Department wanted to modernize the Nicaraguan Guard so that it might be easily integrated into the American Army in case of need. Despite these sentiments, Somoza encountered considerable difficulty in obtaining the arms he desired. Evidence of the importance he attached to this matter was provided by the person he selected to handle negotiations in this matter, his eldest son, Louis Somoza de Bale. Louis had graduated from Louisiana State University, then had been given commission as a captain in the Guardia. All of the director's efforts proved unavailing since the State Department intervened to block the proposed arms sales. Concern over Central American conditions was one factor in this decision, but more important were the renewed indications that Somoza was once again seeking some means to perpetuate himself in power beyond 1947. The department feared that any arms which we might ship him at this time could only be taken by him, by the Nicaraguan public, and by other republics of Central America and of the hemisphere as a demonstration of our complete support for his plans. The impression would not only be erroneous, but extremely embarrassing. The renewed efforts by President Somoza to find some means for manipulating his own reelection had begun in early 1945. In an effort to broaden his base of support, he courted Nicaragua's infant labor movement, pushing through the Congress a new labor code with provisions which were, by Central American standards, remarkably progressive. New unions operating under government sponsorship were also created in an effort to make Nicaraguans believe that his ambitions had American support. He had his ambassador in Washington, son-in-law, Guillermo Sevilla Sacasa, spread reports that the United States warned him to stay in office beyond 1947. Such efforts further angered the State Department, which he believed that his determination to continue to control, if not in power, will bring rising opposition, especially since Somoza was continuing to expand his widespread commercial activities. The succession of Harry Truman by the American presidency and his appointment of James Burns as Secretary of State produced a change in United States policy toward Nicaragua while still paying lip service to the idea of non-interference in internal affairs. The State Department now began active efforts to block Somoza's plans for re-election. On August 1st, Assistant Secretary of State Nelson Rockefeller called the Nicaraguan ambassador and bluntly informed him that should Somoza run for re-election, it might create difficulties for him, which would seriously affect relations between the two countries. Informed of this conversation, the dictator sought to soften American opposition. He informed the American ambassador that the whole business of his running for re-election is a big game and that he had not authorized the proclamation of his candidacies that were being made. He claimed that he had not repudiated these efforts before. If he did, Guardia officers would begin to seek the presidency for themselves, and the Guardia Nacional would get out of control. In addition, the president asserted that by allowing his own candidacy to remain a possibility until the last minute, he would be in a position to select as his successor an individual who would serve patriotically and loyally the interests of Nicaragua and the United States. Claiming that he neither wanted nor intended to run for re-election, he invited the American ambassador and the State Department to join him by selecting his successor, a proposal the department quickly declined. And so, Harry Truman, basically, wanted, Harry Truman and Nelson Rockefeller wanted Somoza out. Despite Somoza's protestations, the State Department continued to believe that he sought re-election and continued to oppose any such course. Ambassador Warren informed the department that the size of his investments in Nicaragua made the president unwilling to even consider the possibility of allowing anyone hostile to his interests to obtain the presidency. The key to the situation remained the Guardia. The State Department noted that while Somoza had promised free elections, there was nothing in his record to warrant the belief in his promise, and added that his control over the Guardia put him in a position to ensure his own re-election. As predicted, opposition to the proclamation of Somoza's candidacy grew steadily during 1945. By the end of October, an unexpected boost was given to his opposition when both his wife and his eldest son urged him to quit at the end of his term. His wife even wanted him to step down from his post as Jeffy director as well, something the general was totally unwilling to consider. Far from giving up, the Nicaraguan dictator simply increases efforts to build up his military strength in order to ensure his continued rule. Unable to obtain warplanes from the United States government, he tried to obtain commercial aircraft from American suppliers. Ambassador Warren urged the State Department to block any such sales, noting that the Nicaraguan government is already experimenting with mounting machine guns on BT-13s, and adding that any planes we supply Nicaragua at this time will be considered by a good proportion of the populace, perhaps an overwhelming majority, as aid given to present government to suppress its own people. Blocked by the United States, Somoza attempted to obtain planes from British or Canadian sources, but was again opposed by the State Department, which, in addition to its concern over the use to which such planes might be put, was now also angry over Nicaraguan default on its land lease repayments. By November, elements within the Guardia were growing restive over the re-election efforts. There were even some officers who suggested that the president should be bumped off. The American ambassador believed that the Guardia was ready to assist in the removal of Somoza or to take advantage of his removal to forward individual or group interests. Ambassador Warren concluded that if Somoza plans to oppose the revolution with Guardia, he will not have the discipline, obedience, or support he expects. While the State Department was trying to discourage the re-election campaign, it evidently felt that murder was too extreme a measure to employ in accomplishing this end, and Warren was urged to use your influence with the Guardia to avoid the assassination of President Somoza. The younger officers were especially restive, a situation that did not escape the general's attention. He blamed much of this on the American military attaché, Colonel Judson, whom he accused of telling these officers that the Guardia should be non-political, a stance that was equated with disloyalty to Somoza, and that political appointees in the Guardia should be kicked out. Furthermore, the attaché had told the officers that the Guardia could not expect planes, arms, ammunition, or related material until the crisis caused by the president's campaign to succeed himself was resolved. Somoza demanded Judson's immediate recall, a course which the ambassador, despite strong efforts, was unable to alter. To avoid publicizing the incident, it was announced that Judson was taking an extended leave and no replacement was named for some time. Despite the continued opposition of the United States and the unrest within the Guardia, Somoza was still reluctant to abandon his candidacy. In an effort to soften American opposition, he even threatened to pull his younger son, Anastasio Somoza Debayle, known as Tachito, out of West Point. He also tried persuasion, arguing that the Guardia looked on him almost as a father. In other words, it holds personal allegiance to him, and saying that if he were re-elected this time, he would then train the Guardia so that it will be prepared to accept the next president. None of these arguments moved the State Department, nor did they do anything to curb the growing divisions within the Guardia. Motivated by institutional self-interest and concern over possible successors to Somoza as Jeffy director, many officers applied increasing pressure on the general to abandon his efforts. Colonel Louis Manuel Debayle, a brother of the president's wife, even resigned from the Guardia in protest over the re-election campaign, and told the American ambassador that he was debating between trying to lead a Guardia movement against the president or simply leaving the country. The colonel's defection may have been the last straw, for on November 29, 1945, Somoza promised the State Department that he would withdraw his candidacy for 30 days. He even put his promise into writing and also pledged to end the state of siege and release all political prisoners. While his actual public renunciation did not come until early in January 1946, the action marked an end to the general's efforts to retain the presidency. It did not, however, signal any unwillingness on his part to abandon power. Control of the Guardia remained the key power in the Nicaragua, and Somoza was determined to retain that at any cost. He had General Camilo Gonzalez approach the United States Embassy with the idea of his retaining the post of Jeffy director after he left the presidency, an idea that Ambassador Warren bluntly declared would prove unpalatable in Nicaragua and abroad. Such sentiments had no visible effect on Somoza, who made no secret of his intention of continuing as Jeffy director. The effect of all this was summarized by Warren in early 1946 when he wrote, Somoza realizes that in the last analysis, his strongest card is the Guardia Nacional. He has played, as only an expert can, on the loyalty, allegiance, and feelings of the Guardia. Today there is confusion due largely to Somoza in the ranks of the Guardia. He wants both officers and men to look to him as benevolent and beneficent father of the organization, to whom the organization owes everything. He is right in thinking that many hold this impression. He has managed to arouse feelings between civilians and academy-trained officers. The impression left left with him is that only Somoza can manage that both groups continue in the Guardia. The feeling is that without Somoza, the Guardia will be politically purged and reduced to an inefficient police force. The result is that now many of the Guardia consider that Somoza must continue in the presidency, or that Somoza's selected man, in whom the Guardia has confidence, must succeed him. In other words, the most important issue in Nicaragua is not Somoza, but the Guardia Nacional. To the surprise of many, Somoza not only renounced his own candidacy, but actually took some steps toward restoring freedoms in Nicaragua. On January 30th, a massive anti-Somoza parade with estimates of participation ranging from up to 100,000 was allowed in Managua. The Guardia remained in their barracks, and a group of ex-soldiers took part, carrying signs with such slogans as "We want professional and not political chiefs," and for a Guardia Nacional serving a republic and not one man. When the opposition united behind the candidacy of Dr. Aguado, Somoza reluctantly allowed the liberals to nominate his rival in the 1936 election. But Dr. Leonardo Arguello, finding him the most popular candidate he could accept, and evidently believing that his advanced age would make it possible to control him once he took office. A surprising amount of freedom was allowed during the campaign. The press began to attack Somoza directly, and Aguado was able to campaign throughout the nation. There were limits to this freedom, as the Guardia was occasionally used to harass opponents and break up some of their meetings. Of greater import was Somoza's complete control over the electoral machinery, assuring that with his administration counting the votes and with the Guardia supervising the polling places, the liberal candidate would have no problems winning in their official returns, if not in the actual voting. The election was held on February 2nd, 1947. Voters were required to stand in separate lines according to their voting choice. But despite this obvious hazards of standing in Dr. Aguado's line, it was soon clear that, at least in Managua, the majority of the votes were going to Aguado. By nightfall, lines of voters for Aguado were non-existent, but in part due to the official harassment, long lines of people were still waiting to vote for Aguado. At this point, the Guardia dispersed the crowds and rushed the ballots under heavy guard to the National Palace to be counted. The following day, Somoza announced that Dr. Aguello had won the election. The opposition charged fraud, and the defeated candidate even flew to the United States to argue against recognition of the Aguello administration. These efforts accomplished nothing, and Aguello was inaugurated as scheduled on May 1st, 1947. General Somoza had made elaborate plans to ensure his continued power after he left the presidency. A new residence for the Jeffy director, designed along the line similar to a medieval castle known as La Curva, was built on La Loma, dominating the road from Managua to the president's residence. The ammunition formerly stored under the Casa Presidencial was transferred to La Curva, and Somoza moved into the new residence before Aguelo's inauguration. Command of the Guardia's 1st Battalion, which garrisoned La Loma, was given to Major Anastasio Somoza D., the general's younger son, who had recently graduated from West Point. Shortly after inauguration, it became apparent that these preparations alone were not sufficient to maintain Somoza's position. 2 months before his inauguration, the president had privately indicated to the American ambassador his determination to remove Somoza from the Guardia, even if he had to use force to do so. Arguello claimed promises of support for this from many Guardia officers. Ambassador Warren gave some credence to this, observing that although Somoza in the cleverest politico in Nicaragua and knows thoroughly the Guardia Nacional, I am convinced that he does not have control over the Guardia that he once had. I believe that there are those in the Guardia for whom personal gain, or in rare cases through patriotism, might desert him. Somoza had no intention of leaving the Guardia voluntarily. He felt that Arguello was unable to control the force without him, that his supporters would be able to take care of any movement directed toward his removal from the Guardia. Once in office, the new president wasted no time in trying to curb Somoza's power, declaring that he did not have to consult with the general on military appointments. Arguello announced several changes in Guardia assignments. Most notable of these were the removal of Major Anastasio Somoza D. as commander of the 1st Battalion, transfer him to Leon, and removing him from his other post as Guardia Inspector General, and replacing the pro-Somoza chief of police in Managua with Colonel Alberto Baca, one of his own supporters. These actions infuriated Somoza, who attempted to intimidate Arguello by parading the Guardia's 3 tanks in front of the Casa Presidencial. This failed to impress Arguello, who proceeded to appoint a cabinet composed largely of opponents of the general. He then discharged hundreds of government employees whose duties evidently consisted to work on privately owned Somoza properties. The Jeffy director, in response, reduced the 1st and 2nd companies of the 1st Battalion Presidential Guard from 400 to less than 100 men. The men removed from these companies were added to the 3rd company, described by the American charge as Somoza's personal guard, and were assigned to the general properties to La Curva and to Campo del Marte. Undeterred, Arguello called Somoza and informed him that he had deliberately bypassed the office of the Jeffy director in making Guardia assignments to demonstrate to Somoza, as well as to the people of Nicaragua, that he is actually in command. Without consulting Somoza, Arguello had Colonel Medina, the Guardia's new chief of staff, and Colonel Policarpo Gutierrez invite officers to a banquet in the president's honor. Arguello was convinced that the Guardia was abandoning Somoza and that he would be able to get rid of the general without having to resort to force. This would prove to be a fatal misconception. While continuing to issue protestations of loyalty, even asking the American embassy to transmit to the president a guarantee that the Guardia under Somoza would not revolt, the general busied himself with preparations for disposing his own hand-picked successor. He retained control of Congress, and over the president's strong objections, had that body select 3 of his supporters as presidential designates, putting them in line to succeed Arguello. He also sent 2 circular telegrams to all Guardia Department commanders, instructing them to obey only orders issued by Jeffy director and to arrest any officer whom the president might send to replace them. The crisis came on the night of May 25th, 1926. The president had sent for Somoza the previous night, intending to demand his resignation then, but Somoza had pleaded illness as an excuse for not keeping the appointment. The following day, the president informed Somoza that he would have to leave the country, following which his resignation as Jeffy director would be announced. The general appeared to accept this decision, asking only that he be allowed a few days to arrange his affairs, a request the president foolishly granted. Somoza immediately began active coup preparations. He made unsuccessful overtures to the conservative and independent Liberal Party, offering them posts in the cabinet, Congress, and local government in return for their cooperation in the planned coup. After some deliberations, this offer was turned down, but the opposition refrained from communicating any word of the general's actions to the government. At 2 p.m. on the morning of May 26, the Guardia struck. They seized the Campo del Marte, the Palacio Nacional, which housed the Congress and most government ministries, and the Managua police barracks, and cut off all communications with the presidential palace. Arguello supporters were apparently taken by complete surprise, and the coup was carried off without bloodshed. Several Guardia officers loyal to Arguello were arrested and took refuge in the Casa Presidencial. Somoza refrained from directly attacking the president, preferring to starve him out if necessary. Meanwhile, reinforcements poured into Managua, and soldiers were stationed at key points throughout the city. Arguello refused demands for his resignation, but on May 27th, he and 11 officers took refuge in the Mexican embassy. The Congress was then ordered to meet and was informed that Arguello had tried to split the Guardia, murdered the Jeffy director, and dissolve Congress so that he could rule as dictator. Coming from Somoza, the last charge sounded a bit strange, but surrounded by Guardia bayonets, the members of the Congress were in no position to appreciate the irony. They did as they were told, removing Arguello and installing Benjamin Lacayo Sacasa as provincial president. The coup had succeeded for Somoza, but it produced major consequences. Taking their cue from the United States, none of the other American republics would recognize the new regime. The United States took action aimed directly at the Guardia, demanding the return of all ammunition belonging to the military mission, halting all material and instructional aid, and withdrawing the American director from the Academia Militar. This led Somoza to appoint his own son as the first Nicaraguan director of that institution. In an effort to regain American support, Somoza called a new Constituent Assembly and included his new Constitution's strong anti-communist provisions, thus provisions making it easier to allow the United States to establish military bases in Nicaragua. In addition, the Assembly selected Victor Roman Y. Reyes, an uncle of Somoza, as president. The State Department was unmoved by these efforts and continued to withhold recognition and military aid. Opposition political parties also refused, despite repeated overtures to cooperate with Somoza. In early September, led by Nicaragua's perennial revolutionary Emilio Chamorro, they attempted to overthrow the government. As usual, the plans were discovered before the uprising. The party was ready and aided by the use of Lend-Lease equipment, FAN, to strafing the rebels, put down the uprising with only a reported 15 Guardia casualties. Chamorro, under the protection of the American embassy, left for exile in Mexico, while hundreds of other opposition leaders were arrested in an impressive show of Somoza's strength. The abortive uprising represented the last real threat to the new regime. By the end of the year, the diplomatic boycott had begun to break down as both Costa Rica and the Dominican Republic recognized the Roman E. Reyes in administration. In January 1948, the new constitution was proclaimed. In addition to outlawing the Communist Party, it contained provisions placating all transfers, troop movements, and promotions under control of the Jefe director, eliminating the possibility of any future president adopting Arguelles tactics. The United States continued to withhold recognition until after the Inter-American meeting of foreign ministers at Bogota in April 1948. At that meeting, a resolution was adopted urging the continuity of diplomatic relations among hemispheric nations. In conformity with that resolution, the United States announced plans to reestablish relations with Nicaragua. Reestablishment of relations was complicated by a revolution that had broken out in March in neighboring Costa Rica. Defeated in presidential elections, the government of President Teodoro Picada had annulled the elections, leading to an uprising led by Jose Figueres and supported by a collection of exiles and soldiers of fortune from various Latin American nations known as the Caribbean Legion. Somoza, who reportedly developed a profitable cattle smuggling business with officials of the Picado administration, denounced the uprising as a communist-dominated and hurriedly dispatched aid to Picado. The general reportedly even offered to fly 1,000 Guardia to San Jose, but even Picado was not willing to have his regime preserved by Nicaraguan bayonets, and the offer was declined. Somoza did send several hundred Guardia across the border, allegedly with the Picado's permission, claiming that they were being used only to repel planned attacks on Nicaragua. They reported one major clash with a column of Costa Rican revolutionaries, but the intervention, remote from the center of power and population, had no influence on the outcome of the struggle. The revolution triumphed, and Picado and ex-president Calderon Guardia sought refuge in Nicaragua. Figueres' triumph only deepened the antipathy between the Costa Rican leader and Somoza. Despite United States opposition, the Nicaraguan strongman had purchased additional arms for his troops, including B-24 bombers from Brazil for possible use against Costa Rica. In December, a force of Costa Rican exiles, armed and equipped by the Guardia, and according to some reports, including Guardia's fights out of uniform, invaded Costa Rica. Somoza evidently hoped this might lead to an open conflict between Nicaragua and Costa Rica, but the rapid defeat of the exiles, combined with the United States pressure to limit the conflict, prevented this from happening. In 1949, Somoza turned his attention back to domestic considerations. General Chamorro was allowed to return from exile, and he and Somoza negotiated a compromise political agreement. Announced early in 1950, this provided for calling another constituent assembly and holding simultaneously a new presidential election. The minority party was guaranteed at least one-third of the seats in Congress and various other government posts, including a seat on the Supreme Court. Elections were held in May 1950 with Somoza, the Liberals candidate, and Chamorro, now in his late 70s, running for the conservative president. Roman E. Reyes died 2 weeks before the election, and Congress unanimously chose Somoza to succeed him. 2 weeks later, the newly appointed president won re-election by a margin of over 100,000 votes. With Somoza back in the presidency, the Guardia enjoyed continued growth and prosperity. From the 1949 to 1950 fiscal year to 1953 to 1954 fiscal year, the force's budget nearly doubled, but the personnel assigned to combat units actually declined. There were large increases in the police and Air Force contingents. United States aid to the Guardia, motivated in part by preoccupation with the alleged communist influence on the Guatemalan government, increased greatly. In 1952, an Air Force mission was sent to Nicaragua. The following year, an aggression establishing the Army mission was signed, and in 1954, a military assistance program was begun. All of this made it even more unlikely that any attempt to remove Somoza could succeed without the acquiescence, if not the support, of the Guardia. By 1954, the United States had determined to overthrow the Arbenz government in Guatemala. Large quantities of American arms were flown into Nicaragua, some of which were turned over to the Guatemalan exiles preparing for a CIA-sponsored invasion of their homeland. Most, however, remained in control of the Guardia, for General Somoza had other plans for their use.
In 1954, another attempt had been made on Somoza's life. A group of conspirators financed by General Zamora and encouraged by Costa Rican government of President Figueres had planned to ambush Somoza when he returned from a visit with the American ambassador. But as usual, word of the plot got leaked and the conspirators were hunted down. Somoza showed special vindictiveness towards several former Guardia officers involved in the plot, offering a special $10,000 reward for them and shooting any who fell into his hands. Angered by Costa Rican support for the plot, the Nicaraguan dictator sought to overthrow the Figueres regime. In preparation for a possible conflict, he purchased 25 P-51 fighters from Sweden, making FAN Central America's largest air force. The Guardia's ground combat capability had already been enhanced by the United States aid in equipping and training a battalion of troops. The Battalion de Combat Somoza at a reported cost of $600,000. Open combat began in January 1955 when another force of Costa Rican exiles, supported by some Guardia troops fighting out of uniform and aided by few of the P-51s, evidently piloted by Costa Rican exiles, crossed the border and attempted to march on San Jose. Despite Somoza's claim the Costa Rican government was aiding communist plots in Central America, the United States was determined to halt this conflict. Navy planes from the Canal Zone were sent to help prevent direct Guardia intervention in the fighting, and the Organization of American States condemned the participation of foreign forces and asked Nicaragua to close its border to further supply for the rebels. Ultimately, Costa Rican forces managed to defeat the invaders, and an uneasy peace was restored. The dispute was Somoza's last serious external conflict. By the time it ended, he had less than a year to live. Late in 1955, he announced his determination to serve another term in office, and in September 1956, he traveled to Lyon to receive the inevitable nomination of his Liberal Nationalist Party. He took even greater than his usual security precautions for the trip, but these were to prove ineffective. On September 20th, he was officially nominated, and the following night, he attended a reception at Casa del Opera in Lyon. Without warning, a young poet, Rigoberto Lopez Perez, pulled a revolver and fired 4 shots at point-blank range into the Nicaraguan president. An instant later, Perez was riddled by shots from Somoza's bodyguards. The wounded dictator was rushed to Managua by helicopter. Then, through the personal intercession of Thomas Whelan, the American ambassador and a personal intimate of Somoza's, he was flown to Gorgas Hospital in Canal Zone. Several prominent American physicians, among the commander of the Walter Reed Army Hospital, were sent by President Eisenhower to treat the wounded general, but despite his array of medical talent, Somoza never fully regained consciousness, expiring in the early morning hours of September 29, 1956. An era in Nicaraguan history had come to an abrupt end. So that's basically the chapter per President Somoza. So we can see, I mean, it's pretty clear. Let's give you a bird's eye view of this. Somoza was, a power-hungry monster. He was put there by the U.S. government. He was a power-hungry monster, and he was, just a threat to, international peace and security. He created, multiple situations in which he, basically wanted to enrich himself. Numerous times he was responsible for his own, illegal activities, illegal activities and breaking the Constitution. Again, an illegitimate government placed there by the United States of America, an illegitimate regime by the white murderous butchers of Washington. They created this guy who was a mass murderer, mass torturer, and mass rapist of his people, and he proceeded to do so pretty well. He was pretty good at murdering. They provided the machine guns over and over, the military hardware and the machine guns to the Latin American people for them to, engage in machine gun violence, to, form governments and produce, a very unstable situation for peace and security in the nation. The people hated his guts. It was clear the people wanted him out. And, you saw Roosevelt was very friendly with him. That was, one thing. And then we saw, in 1939, he pushed through a measure calling for a constituent assembly. Delegates were elected in November, met in December, dissolving the Congress and assuming the powers of government. The conservatives boycotted the elections, allowing Somoza to dominate the assembly without resorting to force or fraud. By February, the puppet assembly had already established an 11,000 word draft to consider. And 7 weeks later, Nicaragua was presented with its Constitution of 1939. So he just threw out anything in the Constitution that would prevent his, maintenance in power, maintenance with money. This is a standard thing. This is an illiterate fraud that, the U.S. government placed there. He's an illiterate fraud. Just like their frauds in Washington, they do the same kind of nonsense and garbage. They, just throw things out when they feel willy-nilly that they're not working for them or they're not working for their own personal enrichment. They are frauds, murderous butchers of the U.S. government, white murderous butchers of the U.S. government. So that's, one thing. We saw that. And then we saw, additional things was, by the end of 1940, General Somoza was already pressing to have Mullen's appointment extended beyond its original term. Pleased with the academia's progress he had made with the American director, a brigadier general in the Guardia. He had made the American director a brigadier general in the Guardia, paying him $385 a month. Mullins was reappointed for an additional year, and additional people were sent to join. So this is, obviously this is, a way of, encouraging this mass murder and mass butcher of, Nicaragua. This butcher of Nicaragua was encouraged by the American government over and over. They encouraged this butcher to continue his reign of terror against the Nicaraguan people. The standard thing, the people of the United States are disrespected in Latin America. They are not politically respected. They're given, poor marks, failed marks. Their, interventions are failures. They're colonial failures. They are just, abysmal performance by the United States, murderous butchers. So continuing on, Brigadier General Dwight Eisenhower approved the project, estimated its cost as $2 million, and declaring that it would be of definite military value in hemispheric defense. There was a construction of a barge canal. Somoza had requested money for a barge canal, and, the road was completed, but it became the classic case of American mismanagement and poor planning in foreign aid. So the people got no money. So again, the U.S. government pretends to be interested in development in the country, but actually they just put somebody in that is incompatible with development. They're mutually exclusive and incompatible with the development of the local people of Nicaragua. They have no interest in understanding the people's needs, no interest in understanding what really needs to be done to improve the situation of the peasants, and, openly enriching the one guy in Nicaragua that has all the money and the guns, which is Somoza. And he was a ruthless, brutal, murderous butcher. He was responsible for butchery of the Nicaraguan people, for which the U.S. government, endorsed him and supported him, over and over again. They supported this, butcher of Nicaragua. So continuing on, a conversation between the American charge in Managua and one of the officers, Brigadier General Luther Smith, chief of the military mission section, revealed American motives for participating in the ceremonies. The ceremonies were, campaign increased aid, inviting several American officers and presenting them with medals of honor, pretend medals of honor, fraud. You could see the fraud immediately, medals of honor given by Somoza to the American, military, people. That's, fraud. It's clearly a fraud. It's a deception and lie medals. It's like some sort of Oscar award of, fraudulence, an Oscar award of racist fraudulence, a racist Oscar award. So the charge pointed to the crucial role of the Guardia in Nicaraguan politics, noting that Somoza would doubtless be interested in improving the National Guard by any and every means at his disposal. He added that Somoza would probably remain in command in the Guardia even if he stepped down as president after the next elections, then concluding by urging the army not to burden the country with armaments. General Smith, in reply, voiced the War Department's decision that military missions from foreign countries in the Americas should be avoided at all costs, adding that the War Department wanted to modernize the Nicaraguan Guard so that it might be easily integrated to the American Army in case of need. So obviously they wanted, just a group of thugs that would work for them, and they gave no interest, nothing they cared about the Nicaraguan people. It's an example of U.S. self-serving interest, its capitalist interest. And then we see, Somoza just basically over and over again, just violent overthrow. He overthrew, he was, kicked out of power.
And then Arguello, he planted Arguello there. The election was a fraud. Arguello's election was a fraud. He miscounted the votes. Actually, Aguado had won, but Arguello was put in charge. The U.S. was, fine with that fraud. They didn't question anything. That when the election goes in the direction that the United States wants, they're fine with it. Otherwise, if it's free and fair, then the U.S., hems and haws. Again, we say they're illiterate, murderous butchers of the U.S. government. They destabilize countries and, have no integrity, no honesty, no ethic. They're just murderous butchers, white supremacists, deceitful liars, propagandists, murderers and rapists of the U.S. government. That's ultimately what they end up as. So continuing on, we had that. And so then we saw the General Somoza, basically after he left the presidency, he had elaborate plans to keep the presidency, but then Arguello didn't play his game. Okay, Arguello clearly was being, pushed, from outside people, to stay away from Somoza. Basically the Guardia Nacional was being pushed to stay away from Somoza. He wasted no time in trying to curb Somoza's power, declaring that he would not have to consult with the general on military appointments. He made many changes. He, basically got rid of Somoza. He basically told Somoza, you need to resign. He made an ultimatum. Somoza didn't listen. He created a violent coup. I mean, again, machine gun, resolution of disputes. This is just a tyrant. This is a racist tyrant of Nicaragua that the U.S. government left in power and maintained as a racist tyrant that oppressed the people of Nicaragua. The murderous butchers of Washington maintained this racist tyrant in power for 50 years. It was like a 46-year family dynasty that they had. So basically he murdered so many people in trying to take back the government. The coup, basically nobody accepted the new government. Nobody accepted Somoza's new government he had placed in power. He put someone else in power. He had the coup, and nobody else, accepted the coup. And Lucaya Sacasa was put as president, provincial president. Nobody accepted this, and basically he, didn't get anywhere. And, basically, finally, Somoza just continued his, nonsense. Obviously Truman took a different stance than Roosevelt. Truman, didn't really want Somoza. They were not looking for Somoza. They wanted him out. He was going to murder the people. They saw him as, a ruthless man. But then it changed with Eisenhower. Eisenhower was a good friend. And so the train of politics and deception continued from Washington. Their, wavering stances on Somoza continued in the deception of this, ruthless tyrant, butcher, this murderous rapist and butcher of the people of Nicaragua that was supported by Washington. The ruthless tyrants of Washington, the murderous tyrants of Washington, and the United States government supported this butcher in their campaign. And that was it. And then finally, we found that, the person who, Rigoberto Lopez Perez, delivered point blank, bullets to end this, man's life that was a ruthless tyrant and butcher and needed to be, murdered to get him out of power. He needed to be, taken out of power, whether murdered, but he needed to be taken out of power. He needed to be taken out of power. So that's basically it. That's the whole summary. Again, we went through, we talked about, basically the politics and personalities, Somoza and Sandino. Remember Sandino, a great man, anti-imperialist, against racist exploitation and mass murder by the U.S. government. He was politically assassinated by the American thugs. It was a political failure through destabilization and electoral failure. A partisan guard was created. The U.S. government intended a nonpartisan guard, but ended up with a partisan machine gun government that the U.S. government is. It's a machine gun group of mafia, white supremacist thugs. Selection of the guard was very limited. Sacasa forced to accept Somoza. who is a criminally insane butcher. He had no choice in the matter. The American racist, white supremacist murderer of Sandino. Somoza gave the order with American complicity. We talked about the books misrepresenting the facts and, not misrepresenting, but misinterpreting what actually happened. Somoza is the murderer of Sandino. There's no other question. He's a vindictive, murderous butcher that was put there by the tyrants and racist, murderous, butcher, white supremacists of Washington. Again, glad for you could join us. I'll be back tomorrow and finish the book. And then we have another book coming on. It's going to be, Cuba and Angola, written by Fidel Castro. A great book on Cuba and Angola. Again, Guardians of the Dynasty, please, download the book. It's here. Guardians of the Dynasty, Richard Millett. Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank in Delray Beach. Have a great day.